Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva. I've been doing live streams and videos on the Holy Spirit. That is the underlying theme and its importance in the lives of Christians today. And this current series is called The Biblical Flood. And this is part 3. So let's go ahead and get started. So the title of part 3 is God's Sovereign Plan. And just a small review of last week. We stepped back and asked a foundational question. Are we reading Genesis raw and as it was intended in the original language? Or are we reading a translation that has already made key interpretive decisions for us? Of course, we want the raw, natural one, right? But we saw that because of the limited vocabulary and the reuse of words, therefore, in the ancient language of Hebrews, which had about 3,000 words, it's a very difficult task that the translators had. I'm not saying that the translators got together and they had this pre-existing idea and they said, all right, let's go ahead and work this out. But it was a very difficult job and almost inevitable to insert some sort of interpretive framework into their translation. Translators don't just translate words. They choose between multiply contextually valid words. That is exceptionally true of the ancient Hebrew language. The result is a coherent reading that often aligns with traditional, historically accepted narratives. We modified constraint number 3 to say the narrative is presupposed to be universal, and the language is selected and translated in ways that reinforce that universality. So when I say universal, I mean things like when they use the word world or the word earth to mean like the whole earth or the whole world, versus or humans, and they might say make the flood seem like it was global when maybe it wasn't. In summary, of the English text that we have may not explicitly argue for universality at every point, but the translation choices force it or assume it. Then we added constraint number 6. The text assumes a shared understanding of existing side narratives and therefore refers to them without elaboration, often glossing over details that today can only be reconstructed through speculation. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, that's explicitly or very much the case, but it's also true in other verses. And it's possible that the book of Enoch is one such remaining narrative, whereas all the other narratives are probably lost to time. But that's very speculative. So that constraint number 6 will help me explain some of the most puzzling parts of the book of the early chapters of Genesis, not as seemingly random gaps, but as intentional references to stories the original audience already knew. That brings us back to the purpose of what these constraints themselves are, these 6 that we have. They aren't conclusions, they are guardrails, and they exist to prevent us from forcing modern assumptions onto an ancient text, over-explaining what the text leaves unexplained, and treating silence as absence rather than intentional brevity. Instead, the constraints allow us to ask a better question. What kind of text are we actually dealing with, and how would its original audience have understood it? So that type of exegetical explanation is really at the foundation of my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. Primarily, it started out in the early series with just the New Testament. How would the first century audience have understood it? But now we're talking about the much earlier audience of those who are gathered around Moses as he dictates the early chapters of Genesis. So that question about how the audience would have understood it. That sets up everything for today. Because once we understand how the text communicates, we can start asking questions like, are God's actions in these early chapters random? No, they're not. Or are they part of a deliberate, unfolding plan? I think they are. So the first thing I want to start out doing is making some comparisons, contrasting the Garden of Eden versus the flood. We know both stories very well. I think it's a contrast of mercy and judgment. The perfect mercy of God and the perfect judgment of God. So with Eden, we see that judgment is restrained. So think about it. If God thought this is going sideways, this serpent that I allowed in the garden and this tree that I put in the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they just messed up and they ate from it. Adam and Eve have. Let's just reset things, kill those guys off, start with two new Adam and Eves, and this time we'll have the serpent outside the garden, or we'll just kick him out altogether. Maybe the tree of the knowledge of good and evil needs to be there because maybe they need to eat from it later on when they're more prepared or something like that. So maybe we'll leave the tree, but we'll get rid of the serpent, for instance. If God had done that, then he could have just killed two people, Adam and Eve, judged them as not worthy to continue with the plan and started with two new ones. But he didn't do that. I've argued on this channel that the spiritual death is what happened immediately. So when they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and their eyes were open, they immediately saw that they were naked. I talked about how that meant not that they just suddenly realized that they didn't have clothes on, but they realized just how fragile they are and how many needs they have and how easily they can be hurt. And that was a sign of the Holy Spirit of God departing from them and their instantaneous knowledge of all that is good and all that is evil, which they weren't able to handle at the time. Then humanity, or Adam and Eve, are expelled. They are not destroyed. There was not a reset that took place. We also saw last week that, and we know from the story, that access to the tree of life is removed. So that's why they're kicked out of the garden. Because if they were to continue to have access to the tree of life, they could live indefinitely, forever. That decision or that judgment to kick them out of the garden and for humanity to not have access to the tree of life makes physical death inevitable. Compare that to the flood. Flood is also judgment being executed. You see that the corruption of mankind, their hearts and their minds are thinking about evil, scheming about evil thoughts all the time. It reaches a tipping point, and that calls for the widespread destruction of human and animal life. But we see that a remnant is preserved through Noah and his three sons and their wives through an ark. And we also see that animal life is also preserved. So you can compare those two things together, Eden and the flood. You can see they're both about judgment and they're both about mercy, but they're very different. In Eden, they get kicked out of the garden. That's their judgment, and then they will have inevitable death. That's part of the judgment. There's also judgment about things like pain and labor and working the ground, but it not cooperating. And then with the flood, you see lots of people killed, maybe all of humanity, maybe the humanity of that region, but still it's a lot of people, and also animals that just happen to be there, as far as we know. Now, the common threads is that God intervenes at a specific point or specific threshold. So in the garden, it is when they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. With the flood, it is when the thoughts and hearts, which of course God knows of all of mankind at that time, they're just evil through and through. So that's the threshold. Pretty low bar, I guess you'd say. And you see that judgment and mercy are both present. If you say, well, how is there mercy with the flood? Well, as Peter talks about in his epistle, the 8 people are saved from evilness, from the evil of the world, through water, through the flood. So he doesn't just kill everything and start over. He keeps these 8 people and the animals that are on the ark at least, and then any humans or any animals that are outside, if they are outside of the flood, if the flood was not global but was regional, then of course they continue to leave. So in both cases you see that there's a remnant preserved. In the Adam and Eve story, it's Adam and Eve, or I should say in the garden it's Adam and Eve, and in the flood it's Noah, his wife, and his sons and their wives. 8 people. Now you should see what hasn't happened yet either. It's common to both of these stories. So the Messiah has not come. It does not come. If you've ever asked yourself, well, why did Jesus come when he did? Why didn't he come earlier? Well, if he had come right after the eating of the fall of man, if he'd come right after the fall of Adam and Eve, then he would just be dealing with 2 people that he needed to die for and that they would need to listen to and have faith in. If you think about the flood, before the flood, the Messiah could have come, or after the flood, the Messiah could have come. He could have died for those 8 people, for instance, and then those 8 people would have to have gained faith in Jesus. But we see that did not happen. So God's preconditions for the Messiah coming, whatever they are, we can speculate what they are, but we can definitely agree that those preconditions have not yet been met. This might seem a little bit out of purpose, but it will fit. I want to talk about Calvinism and Arminianism. Those are theological terms for schools of thought about God and humans and free will and other things and judgment. And I want to start by reading one of the main texts that talks about this. Let's set the tone, as it were. So this is from the book of Romans. So Paul wrote this to the church in Rome, and it's chapter 9, and I'm going to start in verse 6, and maybe I'll read all the way to the end, verse 24. It is not as though God's word had failed, for not all who are descended from Israel are Israel, nor because they are his descendants are they all Abraham's children. On the contrary, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reconciled. In other words, it is not the children by physical descent who are God's children, but it is the children of the promise who are regarded as Adam's offspring. For this was how the promise was stated: at the appointed time I will return, and Sarah will have a son. Not only that, but Rebekah's children were conceived at the same time by our father Isaac. Yet before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose in election might stand, not by works but by him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger. Just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. What then shall we say? Is God unjust? Not at all. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. It does not, therefore, depend on human desire or effort, but on God's mercy. For Scripture says to Pharaoh, I raised you up for this very purpose, that I might display my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. Therefore God has mercy on whom he wants to have mercy, and he hardens whom he wants to harden. One of you will say to me, then why does God still blame us? For who is able to resist his will? But who are you, a human being, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, why did you make me like this? Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for special purposes and some for common use? What if God, although choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath prepared for destruction, What if he did this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, whom he had prepared in advance for glory, even us, whom he also called, not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles? And he goes on. So that is there are other texts. There's Ephesians chapter 1, there's some Psalms, there's Proverbs, there's some in Romans chapter 11. So there's other passages throughout the Bible that talk about predestination and the purpose of God and the will of mankind and the will versus the will of God. Specifically, I want to talk about how Calvinism and Arminianism, those are I guess you'd say, the two major schools of thought that remain in Christianity today, both in Reformed churches as well as in Orthodox churches. Both of these schools of thought have a shared ground. Like, for instance, Romans chapter 9 is central to the discussion. They both agree that God has a purpose and a plan, and that salvation is initiated by God. Now, I put over here, you can see this spectrum where at the top, God determines the outcome entirely. Sovereign grace, there's no human will whatsoever. And then at the other farther end, the lower end of the spectrum, then you have, or I'll just say the other end of the spectrum, you have human determines the outcome. It's entirely based on human will. So in the middle, you have what's called Molinism. These are like middle views. It's sort of a balance between God's sovereignty and human freedom. They intersect. And then you have Calvinism, which is closer to God determining the outcome. God chooses and human response is determined. It's a good summary of that. And then you have Arminianism. That's closer to this other side. God's grace enables, but the human response is free. Humans have free will. And then you can see some other groups that are more extreme in both directions. Hyper-Calvinism up here and semi-Pelagianism. I haven't heard of that, but you have semi and then also full Pelagianism. But these two are the main ones. So you can see that Calvinism has more emphasis on God's choice or God's purpose. God determines who will be saved. Election is not based on a human response. Human choice reflects God's prior decision or comes after God's prior decision. With Arminianism, there's more emphasis on the human response. God desires all to be saved. Election is based on a foreknown response, and human choice plays a real, important, significant role to either accept or decline God's offer of grace and salvation. So there's tension, though. Is God's purpose independent of human will? This is really the answer, or the question, that these two different schools of thought are trying to decide. Or does God's purpose include a human response? Now, why would I be talking about this right now? What does this have to do with the flood or the Garden of Eden? So the reason is because we might not know all about God's future choices, future purpose, and that's really what these are dealing with. But the one thing we do know, at least that which is written in the Bible, we know about his prior choices. We know about what happened in the Garden of Eden. We just talked about that in the prior slide, and we also know what happened with the flood, also on the prior slide. And I argue that these are inarguably his plan. So I argue that it's inarguable because I believe that there's a plan of God and that God doesn't make mistakes. He doesn't go, oops, gotta hit the reset button, or oops, I need to do that. I didn't expect that to happen. He knows these things. God knows the future. And so, but we don't. And so it can be very difficult for us to answer these questions. And that's kind of how I see it. I would say for myself, I think the correct answer is uncertain, and it can only be speculated about how much is God's purpose and how much is man's purpose. Humanity is in the same boat regardless of which one of these two schools of thought or the other schools of thought on that spectrum are true. That is, that no one knows what's going on inside the mind of others. And I would also argue that it's very difficult to know what's going on inside one's own heart. And that really is the realm that we deal with, what is within our own heart. Of course, we are concerned about the fate and salvation of others, but first we have to know ourselves. So would Calvinists and Arminianists agree with these statements about we don't really know, and so we're all in the same boat, and we should maybe just move on or something like that? They would agree with some of those points, but they would definitely not agree with all of them. I think both of them would see more certainty. The Calvinists would see more certainty in the scriptures that talk about God's purpose, and the Arminianists would see more certainty in the scriptures about human free will. But for myself, the correct answer is uncertain and can only be speculated. The reason why we're talking about it now is because we know what happened in the garden, and we know what happened in the flood, and we know what happened afterwards. We know there was Babel, and we know about the other languages that come in, and we know about Abraham. I spoke quite a bit about Abraham and the nation of Israel in the previous series, The History of Judaism. So that's where that particular series kind of takes off. What can we say about God's decisions? We might not know exactly why he makes the decision. We can speculate on that. But we do know what's in Scripture and what decisions he made. And we can make some assumptions or presumptions about those things. So in the garden, the plan can go on with Adam and Eve. We know that because they weren't killed. They were judged. They got kicked out of the garden. But the plan is going to go on with them. That's God's intent. It's part of the plan. And it's also true of their offspring. So their offspring don't get to go back in. We know that Cain kills Abel. So that's not a good thing. But then we know that they have Seth. And we also know that the plan can go on with them having the knowledge of good and evil. And Genesis chapter 4 talks about how that somehow that knowledge of good and evil is inherited. Because once Cain gets to an age or a maturity where he has to decide, God says that sin is crouching at his door and he must make a choice. He must deal with it. He must master it, is what he says. We know that their offspring, who are different than Adam and Eve were just created at some age, but Cain and Abel were born. So they were babies and then they grew up. And so we know about those things. And we know they cannot remain in the garden, so the plan has to continue outside of the garden. Now apparently the garden and its animal inhabitants can continue to exist, at least for now. Some people have tried to go out and try to find the Garden of Eden. They, at least from Moses' description in Genesis chapter 2, that's one of the parts of Genesis that he actually gives a lot of detail on, almost as if he wanted people to be able to go see at least where it was, or find where it was. I think it's more that he wanted to know that it was a real place. He wanted us to know that this was all real that is happening. It's not just some sort of figurative story, but there was a Garden of Eden. It had a certain locality. It had Adam to begin with, and so forth. So now what do we know about the flood? Specifically, we know of Adam and Eve's lineage. For instance, we know that given the ancestry and their dates, their ages, that Methuselah, Noah's grandfather, he either died slightly before the flood or he died in the flood, because that is precisely what his age lines up with. We also know, even if that's not true, or even if he happened to die in the year of the flood, before the flood, we know that for sure that of Adam and Eve's lineage, only Noah and his 3 sons are allowed to continue. We know that enough corruption of Adam's line appears to be removed. Again, we only know of Adam and Eve's line for sure. And We know that the reason why the flood happened was because of the evil of people's hearts, but that Noah found favor, and we can make some assumptions that Noah was a good dad and passed on some of that goodness to his sons. We can say that enough corruption of Adam's line appears to be removed. And then God gives them this command after the flood recedes, that the surviving line of Adam must now go on to be fruitful and spread out across the land. In both events, we know that God acts selectively and not randomly. So we know that in this story, God is moving along with some sort of a plan, and it's not just random. Sometimes it's based on things that we can comprehend, like Noah found favor, so we can sort of speculate. Sometimes it's based on some sort of event, like they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We don't know exactly what that meant or what that entailed, but we know that that's what happened. It wasn't just random that God just woke up one day and said, you know what, I don't want you in the garden anymore. Judgment and mercy are both consistently present, not just in these two stories, but we see that throughout the Bible. And we also see that in these two cases, as well as in future cases, that a remnant is always preserved across time. So what this suggests is that God's decisions are purposeful and planned, even if they're not fully explained to us, even if we don't know exactly what the reasons are. He always has a plan. He's always advancing that plan. There are conditions or thresholds that prompt his intervention throughout time. Other times he just sort of lets the machine tick away, like whatever happened between Adam and Eve getting kicked out of the garden and to the flood. Let that kind of tick away, and suddenly, there's Nephilim and there's evil throughout the world, and then he's like, okay, now I'm back. Not that he left or something like that, but that now he's like, now humanity has proved that it is time to move on with the plan. I want to end with this slide. We have these 6 constraints, and I believe they're very reasonable, and those will be the guardrails for this series. But I want to make some more weaker constraints. For the purpose of this series, I'm going to make some premises about how to move forward. So I have here why introduce premises. The constraints limit the various interpretations that are available, but there's still a lot of, I won't say infinite, but a lot of possibilities. So to make progress in this series, we have to tentatively narrow the field. So these aren't certainties, but they are working assumptions. So the first premise is that there were humans outside the garden. So up until now, I've said, it could have been this way, it could have been that way. I think that there were humans outside of the garden. I think the text argues for that, but it's a less certain idea, so it's a premise. The premise that I'm going to go with for the time being in this series is that there were humans outside of the garden. Humans were created broadly in Genesis chapter 1, male and female. It wasn't like he created a male and then he created a female later on, like we see in Genesis chapter 2. Here you see that in Genesis 1, broadly created, it just says we're going to create mankind in our image, male and female. Part of this premise is that Genesis 2 is not just a simple zoom in of day 6 or the end of day 6, which is what some people think. And I think there's good reason for that, because things like the shrubs were supposed to be created on day 3, and certain birds, for instance, were supposed to be created on day 5, and yet you see them being created or not existing. And then the man comes, is created, that's a human. So you see things out of order. You'd see that if that were the case, birds and some animals were created after humans when they were supposed to be all created before that. So Genesis 2 is not a zoom in on day 6. It is something that happened after day 6. Not saying that the universe was created in exactly 6 days or anything like that. Nevertheless, I'm saying that Genesis chapter 2, starting with Adam and Eve in the garden, that is after the general creation of the universe and the earth. Some garden elements appear to be unique. So there were 2 trees that don't appear to exist anywhere else, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we have this reasoning, speaking serpent, Where did he come from? And we talked last week about how it wasn't the unique thing wasn't that he was speaking, it was that he was reasoning and trying to deceive Eve. So it really seems like the other animals were also special. So we had special trees and special animals. Genesis 4 raises external population questions. So you have this fear that Cain has that he's going to be killed by somebody else. You have him just finding a wife somewhere. And then you have him making a city, which would have just been for him and his wife. It's kind of a big thing, big task to take on. So all these things are convincing evidence that there were humans outside the garden. So that's the premise I'm going with. Humans existed outside the garden, and I would say that they may have even existed for a long time, millennia. They may have existed from, if you look at anthropology, you'll see animals existing, humans, 100,000 years or more. You see like the Australopithecus boisei and Lucy and things like that. So those fossils are there. You can't argue them away. So I'm saying that God did create early hominids, different types of hominids, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others, and humans outside the garden. They may have existed for millennia outside the garden, and then for whatever reason, at some point, he said, all right, I'm making a garden. It's special. I'm putting a man in there. He's special. And he's created as an adult. So forth. Okay. Premise number 2, Adam's line is distinct or unique. It's definitely the line that the Bible follows. But we know there are some special things about at least Adam's line. If it's just Adam and Eve, then it's everybody. But if there's people outside the garden, then it's only imperative that Adam and Eve's and their descendants have these qualities, that they live unusually long lifespans. So it's not true, it's not the case that the humans outside the garden had to also live long lifetimes. Maybe they only lived to like 40 years old, which would be like the average for back then. I said that these unusual lifespans may just be the way they're created, but it also could be a connection to the initial access to the tree of life. We know that the eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that carried on to their offspring. So it's also possible that the tree of life also carried on to their offspring. If they had stayed in the garden, they could have lived forever. But since they only had a few, years or decades in the garden, that gave them a cap of about 1,000 years. Genesis 6 reflects unusual interactions. And so how that says that Adam's line is distinct is that Moses is thinking back to these stories and these narratives that exist back then, maybe the book of Enoch, and he's calling out different groups that were special. He says, hey, the sons of God had children with the daughters of men. And then they created this race or these types of people called the Nephilim. And they were special. They were heroes, men of renown. So that all reflects or points to the fact that Adam's line was different. If the sons of God are Adam and his ancestry, and not just angels or fallen angels, who would have a difficult time, I think, having offspring with humans. I'm not saying it's impossible, but that's the premise that I'm going with. So therefore, Adam's line may have been biologically and functionally distinct. So just after talking about these premises, remember that this is not proven, they're proposed, and they're meant to reduce the possibilities of what's going to go happen in the future episodes and eliminate uncertainty. And we will test this, and the solution will be that it brings harmony to not only these passages, but also to the rest of the Bible. And that's why it matters. Changes how we read the flood and the pre-flood, like who had to be killed, what area had to be flooded. And it reframes questions about corruption, judgment, and these thresholds that God uses as to when to intervene. Thanks for joining in today. Next week, we will get into Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, the sons of God and those pesky Nephilim. Remember to like and subscribe. We're almost at 100 subscribers. I think we're at like 93 or something. But thanks again for joining me, and have a great evening.